The courtroom air felt heavy enough to crush my lungs, and my soon-to-be ex-wife's smug grin only added to the suffocating tension. My palms were slick with sweat, but it wasn't just nerves, it was the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the simmering fury that threatened to burst out of me any second. For months, she'd ridiculed me to anyone who would listen. My friends, our neighbors, even my own mother. And now she was at it again, hurling barbs under her breath, acting like I wasn't even there. Something inside me snapped. I looked around, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out her voice. I didn't realize it yet, but this was the moment everything would change. I remember the start of our relationship with unsettling clarity. We'd met on a warm August night at a friend's backyard barbecue. She'd shown up in a bright sundress, laughing easily at people's jokes and making conversation seem effortless. I was struck by how charming she seemed. A quick wit, a brilliant smile, an energy that drew people in. Our host had introduced us and almost immediately I felt a spark. We clicked. It was like we were old friends who'd been separated by time, and now fate was giving us a chance to reconnect. In those early days, being with her felt like stepping into a dream. We'd stroll around the city late at night, sharing stories under the street lamps. She was so full of life, ambitious, passionate, confident in her own skin. She took an interest in my aspirations, and I reveled in the way she lit up whenever I talked about something I cared about. Our differences seemed complementary. She was spontaneous while I was the methodical planner. She made me feel like I could do anything. It wasn't long before I was in love, utterly convinced I'd found the person who would stand by my side for the rest of my life. During that honeymoon period, we were blissfully unaware of any cracks that might lurk beneath the surface. We believed that love conquered all, that we were special, that nothing could break what we had. We got married in a small ceremony, just family and a few close friends. I looked into her eyes during our vows, certain that I'd never love anyone else more. She gripped my hand, smiling through tears. It felt like the world belonged to us, that everything we dreamed of would come true. Back then, no one could have told me that we'd eventually stand in front of a judge, dividing up our lives like pieces of real estate in a fire sale. But life doesn't always bend to our wishes. The drift started subtly. Maybe it was the stress of work, maybe it was disagreements over finances, or maybe it was just the everyday disappointments that build up like dust in a forgotten room. I noticed her pulling away, growing irritable. At first, I told myself it was a phase, that every couple goes through rough patches. But the gulf between us expanded rapidly, until each conversation felt forced. There was tension in every glance. We had more silences than words. There came a time when I'd walk into a room and sense her entire body tense up, as if my presence alone irritated her. I tried to reach out. I suggested counseling, offered to scale back my work hours so we could spend more time together. She would shrug, sometimes roll her eyes, or just give a non-committal grunt. I remember one night, braving the vulnerability to ask if she still loved me. She laughed at the question, a cold, humorless chuckle, and said, "You're being dramatic." Her dismissive tone stung me, deeper than any insult could have. That was when I started to suspect that whatever we'd once shared was slipping away, and she wasn't interested in saving it. Arguments followed. They started small, sniping about the dishes, frustrations over finances, and escalated into full-blown battles. My gentle suggestions to talk things out were met with mocking retorts. She began to belittle me in front of her friends. One evening, during a dinner party, she joked about how I'd never amount to anything more than an office drone. People laughed politely, uncertain whether it was meant to be a real jab or just teasing. I forced a grin, my stomach twisting in knots. We were in public, and it was easier to pretend everything was fine than to confront her outright and make a scene. But behind closed doors, the tension simmered. I felt humiliated, heartbroken, and unsure how to fix it. Over time, we'd see each other only in passing. It was like we were two strangers sharing a mailbox and a bed frame, resentments piling up like junk mail. One morning, I woke up to find she'd taken half of her clothes and left a note on the kitchen table. "I need time," it read, almost like an afterthought. She crashed at her sister's place for a few days, and by the time she returned, it was obvious there was nothing left for us to salvage. Within a week, she'd filed for divorce. I remember looking at those papers and feeling the finality of it slam into me like a freight train. After all the love, all the promises, all the dreams, here we were, dividing everything up in black and white, with lawyers as our witnesses. The divorce proceedings began cordially enough. An almost perfunctory exchange of documents, establishing who got the house, who got the car. But then things took a cruel turn. She started making demands that caught me off guard, from spousal support to petty claims about possessions she didn't even like. But I didn't mind those details as much as I minded her blatant disrespect. Whenever we were in mediation, she'd roll her eyes at my statements, toss her hair, and occasionally say something like, "Well, clearly he never grew up." She'd do it quietly, under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear. My attorney warned me not to react, that it would only hurt my position. So I gritted my teeth and tried to stay composed. Then came the day we had to stand in court, finalize the separation, and address some contested issues. I was a bundle of nerves. I wore my best suit, hoping to look as dignified as I could. She arrived late, breezing in with an air of confidence, wearing a sleek black dress and heels that clicked sharply against the courthouse floor. She barely glanced at me. We took our seats and the judge began to go over our case. But it was my wife's mocking attitude that truly set the tone. Whenever I tried to speak, she'd whisper sarcastic comments to her lawyer, or shake her head, smirking as if my words were some kind of joke. I tried to steady myself, to focus on the process. This was a legal proceeding, not a battlefield. My attorney presented our side, addressing the arguments about property distribution, the issues surrounding her new claims of emotional distress. She had filed some last-minute allegations, painting me as cold and unsupportive, accusing me of neglect. The frustration boiled in my veins, but I maintained a calm facade. The judge nodded thoughtfully, listening to both sides, urging respect and decorum. Yet there she was, whispering to her lawyer and occasionally bursting into muffled laughter. My pulse throbbed in my temples. Had I really loved this woman once? The question cut through me like a knife, but I forced myself to stay composed for the sake of the hearing. Still, her subtle digs kept coming. She brought up an injury I'd had from high school football, making it sound like I was just being dramatic about an old ache in my shoulder. She pointed out how I'd once left a decent-paying job to try starting a small business, only to fail. "He can't finish anything he starts," she declared to the judge. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, the discussion turned toward something personal, an incident that occurred a few years back, when I'd been working too many hours and fainted at home from exhaustion. I'd ended up with a deep bruise on my side. My wife's lawyer claimed that it was evidence of my poor health, of me being incapable of coping with stress. "He's easily overwhelmed, as you can see," her attorney said. And that was when she turned to me, sneering. "He's too weak to handle even the smallest responsibilities. Everyone in our circle knows that." I don't know what overcame me, but in that moment I felt something inside my chest crack open. It wasn't just anger, it was the final straw, the realization that I was done letting her rewrite our history and demean me in front of others. I rose from my seat, my hands trembling with adrenaline. I said to the judge, "Your Honor, I need to show you something." He gave me a puzzled look and my own attorney's eyes widened in alarm. But I was beyond caring about protocol. I needed to reveal the proof of the life we'd actually shared. My wife rolled her eyes again, snickering into her hand. I saw red. Without another word, I slipped off my suit jacket and began to unbutton my shirt. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. I could hear the rustle of fabric and the squeak of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. The judge raised a hand, about to say something, but then he saw the scars on my torso. I heard the collective intake of breath as I peeled my shirt open to reveal a faint but distinct patchwork of old bruises and marks. These were not from any single incident. They were a mosaic of memories, a couple from that fainting episode, yes, but others from rough times we'd faced together, injuries from a minor car accident, bruises I'd gotten trying to fix a broken water heater when the piping gave out, and a visible burn scar from a kitchen fire I'd put out just last year, while saving her prized recipe books. In that silent moment I found my voice, shaky and raw. "Weak?" I said, my voice echoing in the hushed room. "Your Honor, these scars. This is what comes from years of making sacrifices. For this marriage, for our home, for her. I'm not proud of them, but they're real. I've worked 2 jobs at times, carried heavy burdens, literally and figuratively, to keep us afloat. I've hurt myself and kept going. I fainted from exhaustion once because I was pulling 16-hour days to pay down credit card debt that she racked up. I never said a word because I thought that's what a husband was supposed to do. Shoulder the load, keep going." My ex-wife's smirk vanished. The entire courtroom grew so quiet that the buzzing of the fluorescent lights sounded deafening. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat resonating in my ears. My attorney's face was pale, as if he'd never seen a stunt like this before. But I went on, fueled by years of pent-up hurt and betrayal. "I've been trying to defend myself against her claims that I'm worthless, that I'm irresponsible. But the truth is, the only reason I ever stumbled was that I was trying to hold up our marriage when she stopped caring. She calls me weak, but if it's weak to have scars from fighting for something you once believed in, then fine, I guess I'm weak. I stopped there, unsure what else to say. The judge cleared his throat, his expression stern but not unkind. He motioned for me to put my shirt back on. With trembling hands I buttoned it up, aware that tears were burning at the corners of my eyes. I wondered if I'd just destroyed any chance I had of coming across as rational and calm. But I couldn't bury my truth any longer. I needed everyone to see that I wasn't the man my wife claimed I was. The court reporter stared down at her notes, probably scribbling furiously to capture what had just happened. My wife looked completely taken aback. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, likely urging her to remain composed. After a pregnant pause, the judge cleared his throat again. "Let's take a brief recess," he said. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Counsel, I'd like to speak with each of you privately." I gathered my things and stepped into the hallway, my heart still hammering. My attorney pulled me aside. At first, he looked furious, but his expression softened when he saw how upset I was. He took a deep breath and said, "I wish you'd told me you planned to do that. But it might not have been the worst thing for your case." I could only nod, my emotions a tangled mess of relief, fear, and exhaustion. I took a seat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, trying to calm myself. My shirt felt damp against my skin, and my chest rose and fell with uneven, ragged breaths. People were moving through the hallway, talking in hushed whispers, occasionally sneaking glances my way. Part of me wanted to hide. Another part felt oddly liberated, like I'd finally taken a stand. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Messages of concern from friends who knew we were in court that day and from my mom who had insisted on updates. But I didn't respond. I couldn't talk to anyone just yet. After what felt like both an eternity and a single moment, the bailiff announced that everyone needed to return inside. I squared my shoulders and walked back, my mind a blur. The judge fixed me with a measured gaze. "Sir," he addressed me, "I understand tensions are high. However, I must remind you and both counsel to adhere to courtroom protocol. That being said, I have heard your concerns and seen your demonstration. Let's proceed." My wife's lawyer spoke first. In a voice that lacked its earlier edge, she tried to reassert the narrative that I was irresponsible. She brought up finances, but the judge cut her short with a raised hand, clearly not in the mood for prolonged argument. Then it was my turn. My attorney carefully laid out the timeline of our marriage, how I'd worked multiple jobs, how I'd used my personal savings to pay off credit cards, how I'd taken on responsibilities at home to support my wife's pursuits. The judge listened closely, occasionally glancing toward my wife. Finally, my wife spoke up. Her voice was quieter now, missing the brash confidence that had been so prevalent earlier. She claimed she'd been pushed to mock me out of frustration, that I never communicated well, that I held my struggles against her. Her words sounded weak, defensive. The woman who once brushed off my pleas to seek counseling was now saying she felt isolated because I refused to open up. The spin made my head reel, but I stayed quiet. I had spoken my truth and I had the scars to prove it. We went through the usual motions of a divorce hearing, tackling property division, accounts, and who was responsible for which debts. But the atmosphere was entirely different now. My wife no longer had the upper hand. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. I saw her eyes flicker with shame or maybe regret. I wondered if she'd ever truly cared about me, or if the idea of having a husband had mattered more to her than the husband himself. A wave of sorrow washed over me. Despite my anger, I realized that part of me still missed the version of her I'd fallen in love with. By the time we reached the final stages, both attorneys seemed eager to wrap things up. The judge issued a clear division of assets. The house was to be sold, with the proceeds split. Certain personal items would remain with each party. The debts we'd accumulated were to be divided based on who had incurred them and when. As for spousal support, the judge offered a measured approach. A short-term arrangement while my wife got back on her feet, since she'd quit her job to go back to school at one point during our marriage, something I had once supported wholeheartedly. I agreed, though part of me bristled at the idea of financially supporting someone who had caused me such pain. Still, I wanted to move on. My sanity was worth more than any petty grudge. The judge gave a brief closing statement, emphasizing the importance of civility and mutual respect. "Divorce is never easy," he said, looking from me to my wife. "But it can be handled with dignity or it can be dragged through the mud. Let's hope from this point on, you both choose to move forward with maturity." He tapped his gavel, signaling an end to the hearing. Afterward, people filed out of the courtroom. My wife lingered near the front, avoiding my gaze. I slowly gathered my things, the adrenaline still buzzing through my veins. My attorney shook my hand, muttering something about how I should lie low, refrain from any more dramatics. I thanked him, too drained to delve into the conversation. As I stepped into the aisle, I noticed my wife watching me. Her expression had shifted from resentment to something resembling guilt or maybe regret. She took a step toward me. I braced myself for another verbal blow, but instead she simply said, "I didn't know you felt so. I never thought you'd." She trailed off, struggling with her words. Seeing her like that, a flicker of our past swept through me. Those nights we'd stayed up until sunrise, lost in conversation, the stolen kisses when we were too giddy with new love to contain ourselves. My eyes misted over, but I blinked away the tears. That part of our lives was gone. I forced a small nod. I guess we both never thought we'd end up here. I could tell she wanted to say more, but I wasn't sure if I could bear hearing it. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and for a moment we just stood there, two people who once believed in forever, now reduced to almost strangers. I managed a quiet good luck, though I wasn't sure I meant it fully. She lowered her head, whispered, "You too," and turned away. The next few days felt surreal. I slept fitfully, haunted by dreams that replayed the moment I took off my shirt in court, the stunned looks on everyone's faces. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I was free to move on, but the echoes of the past reverberated in my mind. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if I'd handled things the right way. There was a pang of shame, a worry that I'd made a spectacle of myself. But then I'd recall the relief of finally standing up for my own truth, the sense that I had nothing left to hide. Friends and family called, checking in to see how I was doing. I told them I was fine, that everything had been settled, that I wanted to put it behind me. My mother cried when she heard the finality in my voice, apologized for not stepping in earlier. I reassured her that it was no one's fault but ours. The truth was, there was nothing to be done now except move forward. I visited the house one last time before the real estate agent listed it. Walking through those empty rooms felt like stepping through a museum of memories, some heartbreakingly beautiful, others painfully bitter. I took a moment in the bedroom where we used to cuddle up on lazy Sundays, the living room where we hosted that disastrous dinner party, the back patio where she once kissed me under the stars. Then I locked the door behind me and slid the key through the mail slot, not looking back. Legally, our divorce wasn't fully finalized until weeks later, but that court hearing was the real turning point. It was the moment the illusions shattered, revealing the raw truth beneath. For so long she had mocked me, belittled me, and I had let it happen because I thought silence was the high road, that stoicism was strength. But it took that drastic move, showing my scars, to make everyone see that her mockery wasn't grounded in reality, that I had endured more than she ever gave me credit for. I didn't do it to humiliate her, though part of me felt vindicated by her stunned reaction. I did it to reclaim my dignity, to refuse to be the butt of her ridicule any longer. Strangely enough, word spread around our social circle about the shirt incident in court. I got texts from friends who heard from other friends, asking if it was really true. Some people thought it was theatrical, others said I was brave. My best friend Mark told me he wished he'd been there to applaud. My ex-wife's close friend, Sharon, reached out with a hesitant apology for believing the worst about me. She admitted that my ex had painted a very one-sided picture of our marriage. That gave me a small sense of validation, though it didn't erase the heartache. If anything, it made me realize how easily we can misunderstand each other when only one narrative is shared. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I moved into a small apartment across town, decorated it with thrift store finds, and tried to create a space that was truly mine. It wasn't much, but it felt good to have control over every little detail, from the color of the walls to the arrangement of the furniture. I went back to my old job. Thankfully, they took me on again after I closed my failed startup, and worked on stabilizing my finances. I also started going to therapy, something I'd always brushed off before. Talking to a professional helped me unpack the layers of resentment, guilt, and lingering sorrow. It wasn't a magic cure, but it gave me the tools to start healing. Some days were easier than others. Sometimes I'd catch myself reminiscing about our early years, about how good it had felt to be in love. I'd wonder if there was any way we could have saved it, if maybe we tried counseling, or if I'd been less silent. Other days, I felt the sting of betrayal so strongly that I'd have to step away from my desk at work, pace around the building, and remind myself that I was out of that toxic environment. But overall, the trajectory was upward. I was growing, learning to redefine who I was without the label of husband. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I was in line at a coffee shop when a familiar voice said my name. I turned and saw my ex-wife standing a few feet away, looking uncertain. She appeared different, more subdued, maybe even humbled. She asked how I was doing and I told her I was fine, doing better. She gave me a small smile, one that lacked her old arrogance. She asked if I'd mind sitting down for a moment. My heart fluttered, but curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. We found a table in the corner. She admitted that life after our divorce hadn't been easy. She'd struggled financially at first, then landed a job that paid the bills but wasn't fulfilling. She said she regretted a lot of how she'd handled things, particularly the mocking and the public belittling. She even mustered the words "I'm sorry," which I never thought I'd hear from her. I listened, calmly sipping my coffee, not sure how much I could forgive, but also aware that I'd come a long way. I told her that I appreciated her apology, that I hoped she was happier now, and that I truly meant it. We parted on decent terms, no longer enemies but certainly not friends. Just two people who once loved each other, sharing a mutual regret that it hadn't worked out. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of lightness. It was as though the final remnants of bitterness lifted from my shoulders. I realized that I didn't hate her, and I didn't hate the life we'd shared. We had some wonderful times, some horrible times, and in the end we both made mistakes. I'd forgiven myself for my failings, and I hoped she would find peace with hers. The scars on my body would remain, some faint, some still noticeable, but they no longer felt like badges of shame. They were symbols of a story I'd lived through and survived, a testament to what I was willing to endure for love, and also a reminder to never again ignore my own needs and self-worth. I often reflect on that day in court, the hush that fell over the room, the judge's stern but empathetic gaze, my wife's shocked silence. If I close my eyes, I can still feel the chill on my skin as I took off my shirt, unveiling the evidence of all those years of strain. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far, if there was a more dignified way to make my case. But every time I second-guess myself, I come back to the same conclusion. I had spent so long letting her narrative dominate, letting her mock me to the point where I felt worthless. That dramatic gesture was the first time I said, "No more." And in a way it set me free. Life now is far from perfect, but it's mine. I wake up each day in my cozy apartment, brew a cup of coffee, and look out the window at the morning sunlight. I'm learning new hobbies, gardening on my tiny balcony, dabbling in watercolor painting. I'm rediscovering who I am without the weight of a toxic relationship anchoring me down. Sometimes I even find myself smiling at the simplest things. A good song on the radio, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery nearby, a chat with an old friend. Little moments of joy that I once overlooked have become my stepping stones to a healthier future. If anyone were to ask me what I've learned from this whole experience, I'd say it's the power of speaking my truth, of not letting shame or fear keep me silent. I learned that scars, both physical and emotional, are part of being human, and they don't define my worth. And most importantly, I discovered that love isn't about one person continually sacrificing while the other ridicules or takes advantage. Love requires mutual respect, understanding, and a willingness to face problems head-on, not sweep them under the rug with eye rolls and insults. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I'll catch a fleeting scent that reminds me of her perfume, and a wave of memory will wash over me, both the good and the bad. But I let it pass. Our marriage is over, and I no longer live in the shadow of her contempt. I've stepped into the sunlight of my own life, knowing that no matter what comes next, I will never again allow someone to mock me into silence. And that, above all else, feels like the truest victory I could ever claim.